So my name is Mike, and I'm a designer, a multidisciplinary designer, working in the film and games industry. I've worked on projects such as Horizon Zero Dawn, developing a kind of cultural background and concept art for how the tribes and how the world works with my studio in Berlin called Character. I've worked on games like Call of Duty, where I was a level designer and production designer. And more recently, films like Blade Runner 2049, where I designed sets and props and helped the director visualize the world. And the most recent thing was that I was thank you. So I worked as a production designer and brand strategist with David Fincher and Tim Miller on Love, Death and Robots. And my job kind of entails a whole series of different disciplines. Sometimes it's illustration, sometimes it's architectural visualization. I'm interested in technology in general, and I like visualizing things. And it ranges from technical things to kind of illustration. This is some concept work for Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, where I helped develop kind of aircraft carriers in space, and a lot of technical design, because I'm interested in systems-based design. For Blade Runner, I designed a lot of sets, such as Kay's apartment, kind of helping visualize how a more dystopian Blade Runner world would look after the original, and that involves animation, VFX, and things like the memory orb, which is the device that Dr. Stelline uses to create replicant memories. It's visualizing and watching the behavior and getting the idea across for the director to understand how the design could work. But I generally think in systems, but one of the things that I set my mind upon a few years ago was to understand how stories work. And that led me to what the subject of today's talk is, which is the power of metaphor. Specifically metaphors that are psychological in nature, as all metaphors generally have to be, but specifically in the world of storytelling. The reason that I really got interested in this is because I genuinely believe that the stories we tell shape us, and we shape the world. And if you tell crap stories, you get a crappy world. As a kind of illustration of just how powerful stories can be in shaping individuals and therefore the world, this is a book called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a piece of trashy fiction, otherwise known as the Jewish Peril. And it suggests that there was a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world, and this was a book that Hitler had a fondness for. And it shaped his worldview, and the consequences of that are obviously pretty dire. So the effect of stories is massive on the individual level, and that means that the world is shaped. And while kind of studying how stories work, I came across many different kind of areas of study, but specifically I bumped into these two guys. On the left is a guy called Joseph Campbell, who's a cultural anthropologist, and he studies mythology, or he studied mythology. And he was interested in traveling the world to understand the stories that different tribal cultures tell each other and tell themselves and why. And on the right is Carl Jung, who's a Swiss psychoanalyst who came up with the major breakthroughs in how we understand how the psyche works. And these guys both agreed, Joseph Campbell was a student of Jung, that the myths and the stories that have been told for thousands of years directly correspond to the way the psyche as a system develops. So these guys were both fascinated with mythology. They were both fascinated by the stories that these cultures tell each other. And when we think of mythology, there's a tendency to generally think of old, antiquated stories that don't really make sense to us anymore. But what they are fundamentally is, on a psychological level, a metaphorical story that helps convey moral and practical lessons. The reason that these stories survive is because they gave us a beneficial value that helped us reproduce over millennia, over tens of thousands of years. And Campbell wrote a book about his kind of fascination with all these different mythologies. And he realized that no matter where he went, the stories that were being told followed a similar pattern, which he condensed down into what he called the Monomyth, which is this fairly complex system that delves into all sorts of metaphysical principles and spirituality. But it's basically a blueprint for how, whether you're from Papua New Guinea or whether you're from, somewhere else, I can't think of an example, that you use this model, and this is the way that stories always function. So you've seen the Monomyth. If you've watched The Lion King, you've seen the Monomyth. If you've watched Mad Max Fury Road, you've seen the Monomyth. If you've watched The Matrix, you've seen it. If you've watched Lord of the Rings, you've seen it. If you've watched Aliens, you've seen it. The monomyth structure manifests itself in all sorts of stories that you wouldn't necessarily know have the same structural backdrop. And today I'm going to talk about the monomyth and the psychological effect of the monomyth using stories that I'm hoping we've all seen, using Star Wars, using The Dark Knight, and using Jurassic Park. So I'm going to try and explain some of the principles of mythology and psychology using these stories. So we'll start with Star Wars. The reason that I'm going to use Star Wars is because, not sure if many of you know, but George Lucas, before he was a film director, he was a cultural anthropologist. He was a student of Joseph Campbell. And he actually created the Star Wars mythology, not by coming out with a mythology and then finding out that it was the same as the monomyth. He actually used the monomyth as the start point to create the Star Wars universe. And to understand the monomyth, I'm going to take you through it, but the first thing to keep in mind is that the monomyth itself is about you. It's about your personal experience of the world, told through metaphor. So imagine a story as a circle, like this, and then we've got two axes. On the vertical axis, we're going to go around it. Well, on the vertical axis, we've got the ordinary world, which is Joseph Campbell's terminology, which is the world of the familiar, the world of the known, the world that you already have an understanding of. And then you move vertically into the special world, which is the world where you don't have any experience and you don't have familiarity. And then on the horizontal axis, or otherwise known as the known and the unknown, on the horizontal axis you have your old self, and then through a death and rebirth, by going through the unknown world, you're reborn as a new self, and then you return. So it's a journey into the underbelly of the unknown, and then you come back with more experience, more confidence, more self-understanding. So I'm going to use 12 steps, which is a simplification of Campbell's very complicated monomyth structure, because it's really pretty advanced. But a guy called Christopher Vogler simplified it in the 80s, and he was a writer on The Lion King. And in order to get the ideas of the monomyth across to Hollywood, he turned it into a memo that made it super clear and super understandable. And I'm going to take you through Star Wars using these 12 steps, just to show you how kind of formulaic, and I mean this in a positive term, going to the opening talk discussing constraints. This is a kind of useful way to understand how stories are actually very constrained. So the first step, and think about these events in the context of your own life. The first step is the ordinary world. We're introduced to our potential hero, and he's in a space where he's protected by authority figures, he's provided for, he's given security and comfort, but he's beginning to suspect that he needs to move on with his life. So he mentions this to these authoritarian figures, and they want to keep him on the farm, but then something turns up, and it's like an intuitive whisper, which is why in the film it's represented by a slightly broken message that's not fully understandable, in much the same way as when you begin to get an inkling that you need to change what you're doing, it comes as a whisper. So this whisper comes and says, you need to go on an adventure. Now, the hero doesn't quite know what to do with this, so he needs to get guidance. So he goes to look for what Joseph Campbell calls meet the mentor. He goes to look for a wise person who can give him some information on what he should do with this inkling. The mentor says you should definitely go and find out what this message from this mysterious woman means. But initially, you're afraid. So you refuse the call, which means that you don't really want to step out of your comfort zone. It's easier to stay in your safe space. The problem with refusing the call is that ultimately life is not going to allow you to continue to refuse the call, which is why, in the context of Star Wars, his protective kind of family figures are destroyed, which means that he then has to cross the threshold. Crossing the threshold is the moment you leave the known world and you go into the unknown world, as represented by the stage in the story where they go to Tatooine. So they go and cross the threshold, and Luke realizes the world is much, much bigger than he understood from the farm. He's exposed to what's known as test allies and enemies in the 6th stage, which is where he's introduced to a bigger understanding of the world at large. He's introduced to people that might help him, people that might hurt him, and he learns new things, and he's given training that allows him to start preparing for what he's about to experience. Stage 7 is the approach, which is having collected his allies and gone on this journey, he then has to go into what in mythology is known as the belly of the whale. Now, the belly of the whale is a representation of the area of your psyche you do not want to go into, because where we need to most look is often where we don't want to look. So in the approach, which is the belly of the whale, in this science fiction version is the Death Star, they then go into this thing, and Luke is confronted with, through the ordeal, with Princess Leia, which one of the reasons that Princess Leia is in the story a sister and not a lover is because it's the idea of integrating the feminine principle, which is a non-sexual concept, which is why many mythologies have concepts of sisters and friends rather than any kind of sexual component, because mythology isn't about the sexual nature of humanity, it's about the feminine and masculine principle. They then go through an ordeal, which is where they face a form of death and rebirth. Luke is swallowed up by a monster, and then he comes back up, having gone through a baptism of sorts, which isn't a coincidental symbol in the story. And many stories depict this scene with a dragon. So if we take The Hobbit, for example, it's about confronting the inner dragon. It's about taking gold from the inner cave by confronting the aspect of yourself that you're terrified of. And in the process of going through this ordeal, you lose a part of yourself. The part of yourself that you gained at the beginning of the journey that said, it's time to go on this crazy adventure. Well, it's run its course now, and that part of you, well, that part dies, but it becomes integrated as a voice in Luke's mind, which is why this voice continues to be with him even after the wise elder has died. But you get a reward. So the 9th stage is the reward, is that Luke now has a new component of his psyche. He has the feminine principle, which offers him guidance and support and nurturing care. They then take the road back, which is crossing the threshold back to the ordinary world where we started. But in doing so, there is a resurrection, which is that Luke is now a pilot, which is what he wanted to be from the beginning. And through this resurrection, he's enabled to actually take on challenges he couldn't previously take on. He destroys the Death Star, and in the process, he returns with the elixir, which is an antiquated way of saying returning with knowledge and wisdom and experience and the strength to take on new challenges. So once you go through this cycle, Campbell referred to it as the master of two worlds, which is that you face the unknown, you realized it won't kill you, you're now stronger. And the idea of this circle is that we have to constantly inspire ourselves to tackle the story, to tackle the circle as many times as possible across our lives. So it's actually a metaphor for psychological development told through these very big theatrical set pieces. So one of the things you might be thinking is that seems fairly formulaic, surely that doesn't apply to so many stories. And one way to look at it is that every single person you've ever met has exactly the same fundamental skull structure, but every person you've ever met has a unique face. Now, you can break the structure, but then you also break comprehensibility. So one of the reasons this structure exists is because it's understandable to us. And of course, you can break it in the same way that art breaks the structure of things. You can do that with stories as well. But to sort of simplify even further why this structure is almost, well, unavoidable, frankly, I'm going to use an example by this guy, Dan Harmon, who, I don't know if any of you are Rick and Morty fans. Sweet. He uses the story circle, which is an even more simple version, when he designs every episode of Rick and Morty. And this is the structure. He says there's the known and the unknown. There's you. You discover you need something. You go. You search. You find. You take. You return. And you've changed. This is an unavoidable principle of being alive. The more you do this, the more you transform yourself. It's a metaphysical principle that we have to encode in stories of metaphor in order to remember how to do it. So, in the words of Joseph Campbell, the monomyth is the idea of human life as a journey towards the ultimate goal of wholeness and self-realization. And this concept of self-realization is from Jungian psychology, uncoincidentally. So, to understand this self-realization, you have to understand a little bit about Carl Jung. So self-realization, sometimes known as the process of individuation, as in becoming an individual, is the backbone of how great stories work. And to understand it, you sort of have to think about how we develop from the point of birth until we're adults. So we start life not as individuals, but we're deeply connected to mother, to father, to nature. We don't even have the cognition to differentiate anything. Everything is one. But then in order to become an individual, you have to be socialized. And the socialization process treats you in certain ways. So if you behave in the way that the expectations are set upon you, then you're rewarded. You're given a treat or you're given a pat on the back. And your ego takes these feedbacks and it says, right, I'm going to use those and I'm going to push them forward into the real world using a persona, which is the masks that we wear. So we all have different personas depending on the situations we're in. You don't talk to your grandma the same way you talk to your friends. We always alter the way that we perform in various social situations in order to navigate the social world. The byproduct of this, though, is that sometimes when you act impulsively or you do other things that you just want to do, you get punished. And that leads to feelings of shame and feelings that you just don't want to have, especially the ego doesn't want to have them. And Jung recognized that in order to suppress these feelings, the ego will push down those impulses that could lead to shame, and they get repressed. So your natural impulses, which are not bad, they just aren't appropriate sometimes, are forced into the shadows. And that means that an entire section of your personality is locked off from you. So we're all composed of this duality. We all want to do something sometimes, but we can't because of the expectations or the rules that are placed upon us. And the persona is the result of those rules. And understanding that is a key way to understand how great stories work. So how do we express this metaphorically in general when we're telling stories? Well, one of the classic ways to depict the shadow and the persona is the concept of the little devil on your shoulder that says impulsively, do it, it'll be fun. But then there's the little angel on the other shoulder that says, no, be good. You don't want to break the rules. Let's do the right thing. And then there's us in the middle. And we have no idea which is the right course of action. And life is just a series of events that challenges our ability to make those decisions. So the word angel actually comes from Latin, it's angelus, and it means messenger. Now, if the angel is the messenger, it begs the question, where did the message come from? And what we rarely reflect upon is that actually our conscience or our sense of what is right and wrong isn't actually our sense at all. We actually inherited it. And in the words of Nietzsche, he said, our conscience is everything that was regularly demanded of us without reason during our childhood by persons who we respected or feared. Faith in authorities is the source of conscience. Oh, a bit of an editing issue there. So this voice that we get isn't ours. We get it from authorities. We get it from authorities at school. We get it from teachers. So we have to conform to an environment with other people, so we conform. Then we move on and we have to conform to professors. Then we move on and we have to conform to employers and bosses. Then we have to move on and maybe conform to the rules of the army, or to police officers, or to whoever is running the code of conduct in the society we live in. And that's all well and good, but the problem is that when those conscience providers are corrupt, we get to situations like this. And the reason that the process of self-realization is so important is it allows people to come up with the personal integrity to challenge the rules that they are supposed to follow. And this picture is quite famous because there's one guy in the crowd. This is a rally, a Nazi rally in the 30s. There's one man who refuses to raise his arm because he's an individual who's psychologically developed. And this is the goal of psychological development, and great storytelling is to help us get there. So I'm going to try and now break apart how these concepts work in the situation of a film that hopefully we've all seen, using The Dark Knight. And The Dark Knight is directed by Christopher Nolan and written by him and his brother, Jonathan Nolan, who is the creator of the series Westworld. He created it with his wife, Lisa Joy. So these guys are really making billion-dollar franchises because they understand these principles. And I'm now going to show you a quick clip of Christopher Nolan talking about how he discovered that these unconscious aspects are really important to storytelling.
In studying English literature and talking a lot about it, I started becoming more at ease with the idea that filmmakers, storytellers, they grasp evocative symbols, they grasp resonant imagery, and the reason these things are evocative and resonant is that they do have other layers, subconscious layers of resonance that the reader, or in the case of film, the filmgoer, can pick up on and interpret in their own way, and that is a valid approach. And that was something in retrospect, I very much needed to learn and get on board with.
The clock is mocking me at this point, so I'm going to have to speed up a bit. But subconscious layers of resonance, he recognized early on that this is important, and he's a student of Jung as well. A lot of his films directly reference Jungian concepts. So if we take this principle of the shadow and the angel and then the ego, well, in The Dark Knight, the ego is Bruce Wayne, and his code of conduct, his conscience, is defined by Batman. So this is the role that he takes up to be a morally strong individual. But in doing so, in repressing his animal instincts, The manifestation of that is the Joker. Now, stories are not about people, they're about psychological forces being personified. These are like the gods of Greek mythology discussing humanity from the clouds above. They're representations of emotions and forces that we don't have voices for. And that's why scenes like this touch us on some way, even though we can't articulate why. And now what I want to basically take you through is watching some scenes with the Joker and Batman with this framework in mind, and seeing the choices of the script and the framing that Christopher Nolan chose to use. So this clip is the equivalent of two gods discussing the nature of humanity, and it's the first time that the shadow gets to interface directly with Bruce Wayne's conscience.
To them, you're just a freak. Like me. They need you right now. When they don't, they'll cast you out. Like a leper. See, their morals, their code. It's a bad joke. Dropped at the first sign of trouble. They're only as good as the world allows them to be. I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other.
So what Nolan is doing is he's giving a voice to the aspects of your personality that don't have a voice themselves. So the idea of the repressed animal, the Joker is those forces, and he's now discussing how arbitrary these rules are with the guardian of the rules of Gotham, which is Batman. So one of the things that people frequently ask is, what's the backstory of the Joker? And he doesn't have one because he doesn't have a backstory, which is why he frequently gives misleading stories of his origins. He is a psychological force, and in this next scene, just want you to think about it metaphorically. You have to demonstrate that this is an animalistic force who's being imprisoned by authoritarian rules that set the expectations for what is right for the order of Gotham.
What do we got? Nothing. No matches on prints, DNA, dental, clothing is custom, no labels. Nothing in his pockets but knives and lint. No name. No other alias.
Go home, Gordon. The clown will keep till morning. Go get some rest. You're gonna need it. Tomorrow you take the big job. You don't have any say in the matter. Commissioner Gordon!
So you have to ask yourself the question, why didn't that scene take place in an office where Commissioner Gordon is given a promotion up the social ladder in a private setting? Because the whole point of this scene is to show the repressed beast within, which is what Jung referred to when you repress your animal impulses. He demonstrates it by showing a caged animal watching this social system reward people that follow the rules. So these images, they're powerfully, they operate on a powerful unconscious level, which is why Nolan uses these settings and these environments in order to demonstrate ideas that we understand on an unconscious level. Now, Jung would refer to the repressed animal instincts of the shadow as the beast within. And what he's doing here, Nolan is doing, is making associations with the idea of a dog. The word dog comes up in the screenplay 29 times for The Dark Knight. The Joker at some point references himself as a dog chasing cars. Denton refers to him as a dog who's been let off his leash. The idea of the dog is a theme that runs through the entire film. In this scene, which is quite an iconic shot, the script says the Joker sticks his head out the window like a dog feeling the wind. This is his first moment of freedom, having broken out of prison. What he's actually doing is building the association that this is the animal part of the personality. So what does the shadow want more than anything else? Keep in mind, it's imprisoned by the rules that Bruce Wayne enforces through Batman. And in this scene, just notice that the Joker isn't a villain in the traditional sense. What does he want as his demand? He doesn't want to take over Gotham. He wants something very specific. And in this scene, pay attention to what that specific demand is.
So you think Batman's made Gotham a better place? You see, this is how crazy Batman's made Gotham. If you want order in Gotham, Batman must take off his mask and turn himself in. Oh, every day he doesn't, people will die. Starting tonight. I'm a man of my word.
So the demands of the Joker is that he wants Batman to take off the mask. Now, this is a relatable concept for all of us in everyday life. We all have impulses that we want to act upon. We're all constantly living to conform to social systems that we might not agree with. We all have to be nice at work. We all have to be nice in social settings. We all have to put on these masks. And what this is doing is amplifying that internal battle that we all have on a personal level to the grand scale of Gotham City. And Nolan has said, completely on the record, that he always saw Gotham as being an allegory for psychological states. So, even down to the final kind of climactic face-off between the Joker and Batman, notice that the Joker doesn't want to kill Batman. He actually wants Batman to break his only rule, which is that he doesn't kill anyone. See the disappointment in the Joker's face when he doesn't get what he wants. What he wants is for the rules to be broken so that he can be freed, because he is repressed by Batman's rule system, because this is an internal representation of Bruce Wayne's state of mind. So, in this story that Nolan's telling, he's using the concepts of the shadow, he's using the concepts of the superego, which is the Freudian term for the rule system, the moral rule system that our personas are led by, and then in the middle is the ego. So the idea of the monomyth is that you go and constantly venture into the world of the shadow and you integrate it, which is that you don't repress the animal within you, you channel its energy and you make it part of yourself. Now, in the story of The Dark Knight, which is the second part of a trilogy, what actually happens is that the idea is that the story by the end of the third film is that you should integrate those animal instincts in order to make them your domesticated friend. But that doesn't happen in the second film. And how do you represent what happens when you don't integrate the shadow? You represent it through a man who is half shadow and half human, a man who was defined by his social conduct, social rule system, who then gets split in half and becomes this completely fractured, broken individual. So this is psychological storytelling told through metaphor. So the story of Batman across the three films is the entire process of individuation. The first stage is Bruce Wayne as a boy, learning about fear through the death of his parents. The second is the middle of life, where you discover that no matter how much you think you're in control, chaos will always get through. And the third film is the discovery that life ends with pain, which is that you get older, which is why Bruce Wayne has a bad back and bad legs in the third film. And then the finale of the movie is him finally taking off the mask and retiring. It's the process of starting from childhood, going through midlife, and retirement. It's the process of individuation told across three films. And the themes of them are based in the actual themes that we go through in life. We start with fear, we experience chaos, eventually we'll experience pain. So subconscious layers of resonance is the reason that these films touch us on a deeper level than just it being a fist fight between some people in costumes. So the ordinary and special world that Campbell described is a metaphor for the known and the unknown, or the persona and the shadow. But ultimately, it comes down to the most fundamental archetype, which is control and chaos. And to understand archetypes, we're going to have a slight change of gear. Archetypes archetypes are kind of complex, but we're going to use Jurassic Park to explain them by just pointing out the examples of how they manifest in a film that, hopefully, we've all seen. So, in order to do that, I'm going to ask you to imagine that your unconscious is the Cookie Monster. And what does the Cookie Monster want more than anything else? He wants tasty cookies. Archetypes are like the pure cookies of the unconscious. And they're composed of attributes in potential behavior. So, as an example of one cookie, imagine the qualities of being stern, being controlling, and being protective. In psychology, this is known as the father archetype. Now, keep in mind, none of this has anything to do with gender. This is to do with the attributes that you manifest as a human being. Other sets of attributes are being feeding, being nurturing, being soothing. This is known as the mother archetype. Now, these are 2 cookies in our cookie box, but they need to be matched with what's known as the animus, which is that if you're born genetically a female, you're going to have a natural predisposition towards certain qualities, and you need to build an understanding or inherit or develop the other aspects of your personality that don't take front stage. So for females, it's the animus, and for males, they must discover the aspect of themselves that they also haven't developed, which is the anima. The reason that you need to do this is because you're not a whole human being if you're only protective, stern, and powerful, and you're not a whole human being if you're only nurturing, soothing, and feeding. You have to be a totality of a person, and the reason for that is that you can't be responsible for life unless you have the total range of human emotions. So this aspect that Jung was talking about is that we're responsible to ourselves to cultivate the full range of human qualities. And in stories like Jurassic Park, once you get the grip of the archetypes, you'll realize that the actual meaning of the story isn't about dinosaurs at all. And the best way to understand a story's meaning is to understand the inciting question that sets the entire journey in action. And in Jurassic Park, the meaning of the entire story is concealed in one small conversation between Ellie and Alan at the beginning of the movie.
You want to have one of those?
I don't want that kid, that breed of a child. Dr. Grant could be intriguing. I mean, what's so wrong with kids?
Oh, Ellie, look, they're noisy, they're messy, they're expensive. They smell.
They do not
Some of them smell.
Oh.
Babies smell.
Now you'll notice that at the exact point when their conversation could lead to actual conflict, the helicopter arrives. Now in mythology, this is known as the herald, which is that at the point where the main question of the story is asked, something will interject that will set the characters in motion on a journey that will help them answer this question, which is, are they ready to be parents? So what Jurassic Park does is it actually tells the story through allegory of becoming responsible for life by using the archetypes of the anima, the animus, chaos, and control. Now, the interplay of these archetypes is done through characters that represent these forces. So we have on the right, we have the feminine principle that needs to develop the masculine principle. We have the male figure who is the masculine principle that needs to develop the feminine principle. And then we have chaos and we have control. Now, this seems fairly obvious, right? White, black, blue on the outside, red on the inside, and then for her it's red on the outside, blue on the inside. These are the inner aspects they haven't yet developed. Now, this is what your unconscious sees. You see a paleontologist, an entrepreneur, a mathematician, and a botanist. But your unconscious is actually processing things on a completely different level, and filmmakers are trying to leverage this power. Now, the devil, who's the representation of chaos across the history of storytelling, and God, these are leveraged in Jurassic Park very, very clearly with visual metaphor in the form of Malcolm, who is our devil, and there's our God. A halo above him while he brings life into being. Now, just to show you just how much this metaphor is baked into the context of Jurassic Park, I'm now going to show you an edit of all the aspects where the script clearly delineates the subtext of God and devil.
In God's name do you think you are?
John Hammond, Ireland and Ireland. Really spectacular. Spared no expense.
Well, John doesn't subscribe to chaos, particularly what it has to say about a little science project.
Oh, swallow Ian.
I insist on being here when they're born. Helps me to trust me.
I can tell instantly about people. It's a gift. I don't blame people for their mistakes, but I do ask that they pay for them.
Thanks, Dad.
I've been present for the birth of every little creature on the science.
You wouldn't do Dr. Stanley, Dr. Grant, you've heard of chaos theory?
I bring scientists. You bring a rock star.
Hello? Hello? Yes?
I really hate that man.
So Spielberg is leveraging the concept of archetypes so that your unconscious goes along with the ride without you even knowing that you're experiencing the same psychological things that are represented in Batman or Fight Club or any number of films that use a slightly different interpretation of exactly the same mythological concepts. So the story starts, and Alan clearly hates kids. But he's now going to be taken on a journey with Ellie where they're both going to experience, through allegory, the concept of being responsible for life. So they go and witness the birth of the raptors. They then have intellectual conversations over lunch about the responsibility towards life. They're talking about dinosaurs, but the subtext is they're talking about children. Alan is then confronted with a micro version of himself. They have the same interests, they have exactly the same clothing, because they're mirrors of each other. And they go on a journey where Ellie is initially confronted with the opportunity to take on maternal responsibility for a sick animal. She even goes so far as sticking her hand in poop, which allegorically may seem slightly familiar to the concept of changing nappies. And Alan stands by at the edge of the frame, very dissatisfied with the entire situation. So he now needs to be put through a challenge that's going to make him understand his instincts towards parental guidance. That comes with going into the cave and confronting the dragon. It's a contemporary version of exactly the same motif that has existed in mythology for thousands of years. In doing so, he finds his inner flame in the context of a flare, and what we're seeing is just the same thing that we've always seen. Ellie has to confront her inner demons by confronting the velociraptor in her own inner cave, where she discovers the importance of taking on masculine power against a very dangerous animal. And these two guys, who are initially polarized by their views that control and chaos are absolutely separate, they have to work together in order to help this entire journey come along. Alan is then rediscovering his connection with his emotions rather than his intellect, and then they're all bonded by their experience and notice that the color of their clothing has now become a neutral mud color, where it was initially blue and pink. And because he's mastered his inner dragon, in the Deus Ex Machina at the end of the film, by showing that he's mastered that aspect, it is that inner dragon that comes and saves them all because he's mastered that aspect of his personality. So they are now a unified family unit, and the question at the beginning is given its answer with this. So this is an allegory for taking on responsibility for life and becoming prepared for the act of becoming a family. So the tagline for the film sums it up: life will find a way. So this is elegant, fucking amazing storytelling. Now, a bit of a tin hat theory, but I spend a lot of time looking at this stuff, so you may have noticed that during the film, on several instances, they display the map. Now, this book, the original book that the film is based upon, and the screenplay was adapted from the book by the same author, was made by a guy called Michael Crichton. He was also the original author of Westworld, which some of you may have seen. Now, in the book, the themes of this being an allegory for basically being a tour of the psyche is very much present. But if you actually look at the layout of Isla Nubla, Nubla meaning clouds, as in where God resides, the actual tour goes through all the areas of the brain. And if you overlay the brain on top of this, what you actually get is they're actually going on a guided tour of the history of the evolution of the brain. And the areas of the brain that the Tyrannosaurus exists in is what's known as the reptilian complex, which is where our instincts are based. So these layers of metaphor are baked in hard. And when you get masters of storytelling, they know this inside out so much, they do a load of shit that you wouldn't even consciously notice just to lay breadcrumbs for their own satisfaction. So, archetypes. Jurassic Park succeeds because it's the interplay of polarities coming to a harmonious conclusion. That's why we find it satisfying, and that's why your Cookie Monster is deeply satisfied. And this is roughly how he feels while watching these archetypes interact with each other.
Mom, hold me a cookie. It means whole lot to me. Cookie! Chocolate chip cookie means whole lot to me. Me not want to make this butter cookie feel bad. Cowabunga! This gingerbread cookie, very important too. Cookie! We love cookie!
Now, Jurassic Park is a masterpiece. I don't know if any of you have seen the sequels to Jurassic Park, but they're absolute horseshit. One of the reasons one of the reasons for this is that Hollywood is not very good at identifying qualitative aspects of a movie, which are metaphorical. That gets lost because they're always busy focusing on the quantitative, which is what can we directly measure, such as the amount of dinosaurs or VFX shots or aspects that are really deeply unimportant to what the human psyche needs to feel fulfilled. And this is, I'm now going to show you a featurette. This isn't a parody, I didn't edit this. This is actually what the film studio put out in order to get people excited about Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom.
In this Jurassic World, you will see more dinosaurs than you've ever seen in all the other Jurassic movies combined.
And we're going to see all the dinosaurs again that we all lost so much in the first movie. We're going to have blue.
We have the Mosasaurus. We have the T-Rex.
We have the baryonyx in this movie. We have the Carnotaurus.
The Carnotaurus fights the Sinoceratops.
We have the Stygimoloch.
We just all love the Stygimoloch. There's dinosaurs everywhere.
So these films flop when it comes to the actual experience because it's just about more of the wrong things. I've spent a lot of time trying to negotiate this system. It's not very pleasant. But I now want to sort of demonstrate what your unconscious feels like or what your Cookie Monster feels like when it believes it's about to get a sequel to Jurassic Park, but instead gets Jurassic World.
Oh boy, cookie jar! Oh boy, full of cookies, me going to eat cookie! Me happy just to think of eating cookies! Oh boy, oh boy!
In this Jurassic World, you will see more dinosaurs than you've ever seen before.
We have the Mosasaurus. We have the T-Rex.
We have the baryonyx in this movie. We have the Carnotaurus. We have the Stygimoloch.
We just all love the Stygimoloch. The Carnotaurus fights the Sinoceratops.
Well, we had so many dinosaurs in the same frame that we had to make the frame bigger.
Cowabunga! Cookie jar empty!
What the fans of the movie like is that we still have those real dinosaurs for the actors to interact with.
No cookies! Oh, me so sad!
You will see more dinosaurs than you've ever seen in all the other Jurassic movies combined.
Me so sad! Wait. There's one cookie left!
Here I am talking about dinosaurs again?
Dinosaurs everywhere.
You know, this cookie eating very emotionally draining.
So one of the reasons that I decided to talk about this today is that I know that we don't all necessarily work directly in storytelling, but we are all delivering story experiences, whether it be through UX or interface or just user experience in general. And I really just want to start getting the idea going that it's not about the quantitative, it's about the qualitative, which is, it is difficult to grasp because it's not measurable, but it's super important. And these things that we're now seeing, these derivative, crappy franchise spin-offs, the reason that they're failing hard is because they try to maximize the quantity without understanding the quality that leads into the stories. Now, I mentioned Westworld before. I don't know if any of you are fans. Season 1 for me is just a masterpiece of storytelling. It's written by Michael Crichton, who came up with the original concept, and Jonathan Nolan, who wrote The Dark Knight with his wife Lisa Joy. They came up with the script for season 1, and this story runs into exactly the same dynamics. It's got the concept of the persona in the form of William and his shadow version. And the story of the Westworld itself is an allegory. Westworld is an allegory for the process of psychodynamics, which is from Freud, which is why the head of the park is Dr. Ford, which is a loose anagram of Dr. Freud. These are psychodynamics being told through visual metaphor and story metaphor. And I just want to now show you a a scene which was written in season 1, which works on a lot of layers because it not only depicts what I think story should be about, but it's also a pretty nice nod to just how wrong the studios are getting it in their pursuit of more.
It's not about giving the guests what you think they want. But that's simple. It is relation, horror, relation. The power trips. The guests don't return for the obvious things we do, the garish things. They come back because of the subtleties, the details. They come back because they discover something they imagine no one had ever noticed before. Something they fall in love with. They're not looking for a story that tells them who they are. They already know who they are. They're here because they want a glimpse of who they could be.
Billy! Let's go.
The only thing your story tells me, Mr. Sizemore, is who you are.
So even the Mr. Sizemore is a metaphor for people that just want more size in the stories they tell. Now, cutting back to the introduction, the Jewish peril and the effect that it had on the world at large, that kind of seems abstract because it is, but I recently found out something from my dad which kind of surprised me, which was that we went to see the Spielberg movie Hook when I was, I don't know how old, and I remember going to see the film, and frankly, it's not one of Spielberg's best, he'll own up to that. But as with all of his movies, there's a strong moral core. And during that film, while I was sat in the cinema with my dad and my sister, who's a few years older than me, we were watching, as you do as a child, just consuming, and my dad said that he had a crystal clear realization while watching that movie, while watching Robin Williams lose connection with his kids because he was paying too much attention to work and not enough attention to them. He came to the crystal clear conclusion that he would never miss any of our school sports events. And he never did. Now, if a story like Hook or a story from Spielberg can have that effect on an individual in a society, and billions of people watch that story, imagine the net global effect of the influence of Spielberg on the way society works right now. And if you look at Spielberg's track record, he is constantly trying to tell stories that remind us of the things that are going horribly wrong, whether it be about The Post, or whether it be about Amistad, or whether it be about the social wrongs. He's constantly trying to shape us in the right direction because he knows the value of storytelling. And the truth is that a story can lead to either this, or it can lead to this. And we are responsible for those stories. If we tell shitty ones, we'll get a shitty world, and we should be held responsible for that. And in the words of Joseph Campbell, discussing Hollywood in the 80s, he said, "The people who write these stories do not have the sense of their responsibility. These stories are making and breaking lives." And that's pretty much the conclusion. So thank you very much.